The signal arrived without warning, a faint pulse clawing its way through the deep space static. It was brief, almost undetectable, like a whisper on the verge of fading away. A red light flickered once on the far console in the Black Star's communications bay. Darius Holt squinted at the screen, uncertain if he had really seen it. The relay often spat out false signals, ghost echoes from cosmic debris or long-dead satellites drifting aimlessly through forgotten sectors. Holt shifted in his seat, rubbing the weariness from his face with his palm. Another glitch, he thought. Still, he leaned forward to pull the last 30 seconds of data. This time, the pulse was longer, 3 short bursts, then silence. Holt froze. A sealed frequency. Alien encryption. He hesitated. This wasn't protocol. The Black Star was a lonely outpost in a forgotten corner of the galaxy, where nothing ever happened. Its crew monitored cargo lanes, pirate activity, and the faintest signals from dying stars. Intercepting encrypted alien transmissions was definitely not part of the daily routine. Holt let out a slow breath and tapped the internal call. "Captain Drake, we have something." A brief pause, then Drake's calm voice responded, "On my way." Holt glanced around the room, seeing that no one else had noticed. They never did. Routine dulled the senses out here. The station had been orbiting the barren edge of the Carala Expanse for nearly 3 years. There was nothing here, no colonies, no fleets, only the hum of engines keeping the Black Star locked in its silent vigil. The door hissed open, and Captain Drake stepped inside, his uniform jacket unbuttoned, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. Holt straightened instinctively, but Drake didn't acknowledge him. His focus was already on the blinking indicator. "What are we looking at?" Drake asked, stepping closer. Holt gestured to the waveform now displayed on the console. "Encrypted signal, sir. Alien origin. Frequency's tight, and the relays are struggling to maintain it, but it's definitely there." Drake leaned in, squinting at the cascading data. The transmission came in fragments, distorted by static and interference. Holt boosted the gain, but the audio that came through was garbled. "Run it through the decoders," Drake ordered. Holt nodded and began the process. The room filled with the sound of distant, distorted voices, scraps of alien words clinging to the edges of the transmission. The decoding was slow. The station's software wasn't built for this kind of encryption. Drake folded his arms. "Where's it coming from?" "A rough estimate puts it near Sector 117, Holt replied. "But there are no registered fleets there. The closest system is Cross Minor, and that's 2 sectors out, deep space." Drake murmured, "Could be a stray distress beacon." Then, a burst of clearer audio cut through the static, sharp and urgent. Holt adjusted the filters, and a voice emerged. The alien dialect was rough, but the station's translation software worked quickly to adapt. "Under attack. Civilians," repeating, "this is Commander Aura of the Vora fleet to Admiral Jorik. We are under attack. Our fleet is evacuating. Immediate assistance required. Coordinates transmitting. Please respond." Drake's eyes narrowed. The voice was strained, layered with static and distant explosions. He glanced at Holt, who had stopped breathing. "Is that real?" Holt asked, barely above a whisper. Drake didn't answer. He knew the sound of desperation when he heard it. "Trace those coordinates," he said, his voice suddenly sharper. "I want to know exactly how far out they are." Holt's fingers flickered across the interface. Drake straightened, turning toward the observation window at the far end of the room. Beyond it, the endless black canvas of space stretched, unbroken by the light of any nearby star. The Black Star drifted alone, a solitary outpost at the edge of humanity's reach. He had been stationed here long enough to know that in the quiet, things could go unnoticed for years. Entire battles could play out in the distance, hidden by the vast emptiness. Another pulse rippled through the console. "There it is again," Holt said, louder this time. "Same coordinates. It's repeating every 90 seconds. Silence filled the room. Drake didn't move. The screen flickered as the transmission looped again, waiting for an answer that wasn't coming. "Sector 117 is empty," Holt finally said. "I ran the scans twice. There's no fleet there. No response signal from Allied ships. If they're expecting reinforcements, they're not coming." Drake exhaled slowly. Run a full sweep of the area. Check for cloaked ships, derelicts, anything. Holt got to work. Drake stared at the black expanse beyond the glass, the alien voice echoing once more in his mind. The sweep returned nothing but cosmic drift and radiation spikes from distant stars. Drake tapped the console impatiently as the data looped for the third time. It felt like searching for shadows in the dark. No sign of anything, Holt reported quietly, his gaze fixed on the cascading sensor data. Even residual radiation is minimal. If there was a fleet here, we'd see it. Drake didn't respond immediately. The words from the transmission looped in his mind, the strained voice, the static-laden desperation. He shifted his focus to the audio waveform on the secondary display. It didn't make sense. A signal this clear, broadcasted directly to this sector, where nothing but the black star drifted. No debris, no reinforcements, just silence. And yet the message kept transmitting. Holt broke the silence. "Should I send another sweep, sir?" Drake shook his head. "It won't show anything different." Holt sat back, fingers hovering over the console, torn between protocol and instinct. The data was unyielding, each scan a mirror of the last. Still, something gnawed at him, a feeling that the answer lay just beyond his reach. He glanced at Drake, who was still staring at the screen, his expression unreadable. The captain was silent, but his mind was working furiously behind the calm facade. "Captain," Holt spoke, his voice lower than usual. "What if it's not a distress signal at all?" Drake didn't look up, but nodded slightly. "What do you mean?" What if it's not a call for help? What if it's a trap?" Holt's words hung in the air, the suggestion hanging like a cloud of tension. A bait to draw us out. Or worse, to get us to send help? Help that won't arrive? Drake finally turned away from the screen, his sharp gaze meeting Holt's. The captain's eyes were piercing, but there was no anger in them, just the weight of experience. "You think it's a ruse?" "Could be. We've intercepted a lot of odd signals in our time here, but none this deliberate. The timing, the coordinates, they don't match anything nearby. But the persistence of it, the repeat." Holt paused, trying to capture the creeping sense of wrongness in his gut. "It's almost as if they want us to see it. Maybe it's a long-range test, or an attempt to draw us into something we're not meant to understand." Drake stepped closer to the console, his expression hardening. "The transmission is too coherent to be a glitch, and it doesn't fit any pattern I've seen from known enemy forces or debris. It's too calculated." There was a brief pause before Drake added, his voice now quieter but resolute. "We can't ignore it. Not when it's this clear. If it's a trap, we'll deal with it, but we can't sit on our hands out here. Keep analyzing the signal. We need answers." Holt nodded, but something lingered uneasily in his mind. The Black Star was isolated out here, far from the core systems, and the station's limited resources made it ill-equipped for an unknown threat. The idea of facing whatever lay behind the signal without backup, or worse, falling into a trap, was terrifying. Yet, Drake's decision was final, and Holt had learned long ago that second-guessing the captain was rarely a good idea. The seconds ticked by, the only sound in the room the soft hum of the station's systems and the faint buzz of the console. Holt initiated a deeper analysis, running the transmission through every available filter, seeking patterns, irregularities, anything that might offer a hint at the sender's true intentions. The waveform continued its dance, broken and distorted, but it refused to reveal more. Suddenly, the screen flickered, showing a flash of new data. Holt leaned forward, heart pounding. The signal had changed, shifted in frequency. Just for a moment, a burst of new information filled the screen. A long series of coordinates. "Captain," Holt said quickly, "I think we have something new. It's changing. The signal's evolving. It's not just repeating anymore. It's giving us directions." Drake was instantly at his side, peering over Holt's shoulder. The new set of coordinates glowed ominously on the screen. It was a series of numbers, broken by odd gaps and sequences that made no immediate sense. Drake's expression didn't waver, but Holt could sense the tension in him. "Run a translation on those," Drake ordered. Holt's fingers flew over the console, trying to extract meaning from the chaotic sequence. The numbers seemed like gibberish, until one by one, they began to form a pattern, a series of points in deep space. A route. A course. It's a path, Holt muttered under his breath. It's leading somewhere. Drake's eyes narrowed as he processed the implications. Could be a rendezvous point, or a drop-off. The room was thick with the weight of unspoken questions. If it was a rendezvous, who was meeting who? And why were they using this old, obscure method to communicate? Why the secrecy? Holt didn't want to voice the worst of it, but it gnawed at him. What if this was a beacon, not for a ship, but for something else? Something meant to lure them into the dark depths of space, away from the station where no one would hear them. Drake broke the silence. We follow it? Holt's stomach twisted. Are you sure? This could be a trap. If we go out there, I'm sure, Drake interrupted. We'll keep our distance, monitor from the Black Star. If it's hostile, we'll have the high ground. But if it's real, if it's not a trap, then we'll be the first to know. The captain turned to the comms console. Send a warning to the fleet. Tell them to keep an eye out, but we're not going to make a move without more intel. Holt hesitated, but then nodded. Understood. As he began drafting the message, Drake continued to study the coordinates, his mind already calculating their next move. Holt couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, whatever this signal was leading to, might be something far worse than either of them had bargained for. The quiet hum of the station grew louder in Holt's ears, as if the very stillness of space was pressing in on him. He sent the message and then turned his attention to the final set of coordinates that kept repeating, waiting for the inevitable next pulse. And when it came, he wasn't sure if it was relief or dread that filled him, because this time, the signal was different. The distortion had faded. There was a message in plain text. Prepare for contact. Chapter 2, The Edge of Contact. The words on the screen seemed to flicker for a moment, as if the station systems were struggling to process the simple message. Holt stared at them, feeling a cold knot form in his stomach. Prepare for contact. The room felt suddenly smaller. The hum of the Black Star's engines, once a comforting reminder of their isolation, now felt like a drumbeat to a countdown. There had been no indication of what kind of contact they were preparing for, but the finality of the message settled into Holt's bones. It was both an invitation and a warning. Drake stood at the console, his face set in concentration, studying the message like it was a riddle he had to solve. Holt could feel the tension in the air, a palpable pressure that made the quiet of space feel suffocating. They were no longer dealing with static and broken transmissions. Whatever this was, it had just become something real. Captain, Holt spoke quietly, not wanting to break the fragile silence that had descended upon the room. What does that mean? Prepare for contact. What contact? Drake didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tapped a few commands into the console, running the message through a series of decryptions and scans. Holt stood by, watching his thoughts swirling. The idea of a hostile encounter had been the first thing to cross his mind, but this was different. It didn't feel like a warning. It felt like an invitation. But to what? The console blinked, and the screen updated with new data. A set of coordinates, different this time, but familiar. They pointed to the same general area near Sector 117, but this time, the trajectory seemed to follow a clear path through deep space. Holt's eyes narrowed as he studied the patterns. It's moving, Drake murmured. The signal isn't stationary anymore. It's a course. Someone's out there, and they're waiting for us to follow. Holt's heart beat a little faster. Should we send a recon ship? I mean, the Black Star is still our best vantage point, but we're not equipped for this kind of operation. A recon could scout ahead, gather more intel. Drake turned his head slowly, meeting Holt's gaze. No, we don't send anyone out there alone. If this is a trap, we'll be the ones who walk into it. The Black Star has the range to keep us safe for now. He let out a long breath and glanced at the console again, as if making sure there was no other information, no other detail that had been missed. But there was nothing else. Only the coordinates, the message, and the static. We're not waiting for orders from anyone else, Drake said, his voice steady but sharp. We're going in? The decision was made. Holt didn't have to like it, but he respected it. The captain was always the one to make the tough calls. And this wasn't the first time Drake had put them in a dangerous position. The Black Star wasn't meant to be a combat vessel. It was a listening post, a lonely outpost far from the heart of the galaxy. But it was still a part of the fleet and part of Drake's crew. They would follow wherever it went. Holt turned back to his console, fingers moving quickly to plot their course. It felt strange, intensely wrong, but there was no avoiding it now. They had to move. The Black Star's engines hummed as Holt calculated the jump. The ship was nimble, capable of rapid acceleration for short-range operations, but it was no warship. No shields, no weapons. Nothing but the barest of crew and resources. Even with Drake's comm, Holt couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to walk into something far bigger than they were ready for. Coordinates locked, Holt said, eyes scanning the display as he made the final adjustments. We're on course, Captain. Should take us about 6 hours to reach the point where the signal is coming from. Drake nodded and stepped back from the console, looking over the silent expanse of space beyond the observation window. 6 hours, he repeated quietly. Time enough for us to think through what we're getting into. Holt swallowed, his nerves taut, but there was no time to dwell on doubt. Should we prep the crew? He asked. If something goes wrong, we need to be ready. Not yet, Drake replied, his gaze still fixed on the void beyond the glass. If it's a contact situation, we'll approach carefully. No need to alert the crew unless things get complicated. Let's keep this quiet for now. The ship's engine rumble grew louder as the Black Star shifted position, aligning itself for the jump. Holt remained at his station, running over the numbers one more time, trying to find any inconsistency, any indication that they might be walking into a trap. But everything looked as expected. Too expected. 6 hours. It wasn't long, but in the quiet of deep space, it felt like an eternity. The first hour passed with little to note. The Black Star cut through the void with no immediate complications. Holt kept a close eye on the course, occasionally checking the status of the signal, which still blinked on the console, a steady pulse that seemed to mock the stillness of space. Drake stood at the front of the command center, his arms crossed, his eyes distant. Holt knew that Drake was weighing the risks, his mind constantly assessing the possibilities. The captain was always calculating, always thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead. Anything yet? Drake asked after a long silence. Holt shook his head. No new developments. Same steady pulse, same course. It's like they're just waiting for us to catch up. Drake's eyes flicked to the readings on the console. They might be. Holt frowned. What do you mean? We're not the only ones listening to this transmission, Drake said slowly. Whoever sent this knows we'll respond. They know we're the only ones out here who could. The question is why. Before Holt could answer, the comms console lit up, a rapid beeping filling the air. The pulse had changed again. It was stronger now, clearer. There was a new message embedded in the transmission, one that wasn't just static. And this time, there was no mistaking it. It was a voice. Welcome, it said, its tone soft but unmistakable, a strange warmth woven into the words. The voice continued, unbothered by the static that crackled around it. We've been waiting for you. Chapter 3, The Waiting Game. The voice, so unexpected and smooth against the static, echoed through the command center of the Black Star, sending a chill down Holt's spine. His hands instinctively hovered over the console, his mind racing to process what had just happened. We've been waiting for you. The words hung in the air, carrying an eerie weight, as if the speaker had known, with absolute certainty, that they would arrive. Holt's breath caught, his eyes flicking to Drake, whose gaze remained fixed on the comm screen. Captain, Holt said, his voice tight. What do we do now? Drake didn't immediately respond. His face was still, his expression unreadable as he leaned forward, his attention fully on the screen. The words from the voice had sent a tremor through him, but his calm exterior never faltered. He was the captain, and in moments like these, his control was the only thing keeping them grounded. Play it back, Drake finally said, his voice steady. We need to hear it again. Holt nodded quickly and replayed the transmission. The voice came through clearer this time, no longer distorted by the interference that had plagued the earlier signals. Its cadence was deliberate, almost measured, and though it held a foreign quality, there was something oddly familiar about it. The voice seemed distant, as though coming from a faraway place, both comforting and unsettling at once. "We've been waiting for you," it repeated, its tone still warm, but with a faint undercurrent of something darker, something almost predatory. Holt glanced at the waveform on the console, noting how the signal surged in intensity. This wasn't a transmission from some random, forgotten satellite. This was deliberate. It was a call, and it was meant for them. Drake's eyes flicked to the screen, studying the waveform's oscillations. "Let's try to isolate the frequency patterns. We need to know if this is a one-time message or if it's a constant transmission." Holt complied, adjusting the settings, but something gnawed at him. The sudden clarity of the voice, combined with the strange certainty in its words, felt wrong. Too deliberate. Too precise. But Drake was right. They couldn't afford to assume anything. Not yet. The next few minutes passed in tense silence as they worked, the sound of their fingers on the controls the only noise in the room. The message looped again and again, but as Holt analyzed the data, a disturbing pattern began to form. The voice wasn't just speaking to them, it was waiting for them to respond. Every few seconds, the transmission pulsed, repeating the same phrase as though it were counting down to something. A countdown to what, though? "Captain, I'm seeing something strange," Holt said, his voice tight. "The signal, it's fading. It's not just a static drop. It's almost like it's pulling back." Drake's eyes narrowed, but his expression remained impassive. "Meaning? It's like it's waiting for us to make a move. The voice is drawing us in somehow. The signal is cycling, almost like it's reaching out and retreating." Drake's brow furrowed as he processed the information. "It could be testing our response, seeing if we'll bite." Holt swallowed, his thoughts spinning. If the voice was indeed trying to manipulate their actions, it was working. Every instinct in him screamed to turn back, to cut the link and return to the safety of their orbit. But Drake wasn't one to run from a mystery. "What's the next step, Captain?" Holt asked, trying to hide the apprehension in his voice. Drake stood still, staring out into the blackness of space, as though he could sense something beyond the edge of the black star's sensors. "We're not turning back," he said, his voice a quiet certainty. "We're going to follow it, but we'll do it carefully." There was a long pause as Drake seemed to consider the infinite blackness beyond their ship, contemplating what could be out there. Then, with a sigh, he turned back to Holt, his tone resolute. "Send a tight beam transmission," he ordered. "We're responding, but we'll keep it brief. We'll show we're not afraid of whatever this is, but we won't give them everything." Holt hesitated for only a second before complying. He turned to the console, fingers flying over the interface, constructing a reply that was as calculated as their situation. No pleasantries, no formality, just a direct response. "Responding now," Holt said as he activated the comm system, sending a tightly focused pulse back toward the source of the transmission. The reply would be simple but firm. "We are here. What do you want?" The seconds stretched on. Holt's eyes never left the screen, watching for any change in the pattern of the signal. Every pulse, every flicker of data seemed to hold a weight of its own. Then it came, a new message. The voice, soft and precise as before, answered without hesitation. "You will know soon enough." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving a hollow silence in its wake. Holt turned to Drake, his eyes wide with a mix of confusion and growing dread. "What does that mean? You will know soon enough?" That doesn't sound like a warning. It sounds like a threat. Drake didn't immediately respond. His jaw tightened, and for the first time since this all began, Holt saw a crack in the captain's composure. He could see the wheels turning in Drake's mind, weighing the dangers against the unknowns. "We'll find out soon enough," Drake muttered. "But we need to be ready for anything." The ship rumbled slightly as it adjusted its course toward the coordinates, the engines humming with a familiar, but now ominous rhythm. Time was slipping away, and with each passing moment, they were getting closer to whatever waited for them out there. For the first time since Holt had joined the crew of the Black Star, he felt the suffocating weight of isolation. No allies, no backup, nothing but the Black Star itself, drifting toward an unknown fate. "Do you think we're walking into a trap?" Holt asked, unable to keep the question from slipping out. Drake met his eyes, his expression unreadable. It's a possibility. But that's the job, isn't it? We're out here to discover the unknown. The only thing that's certain is that we can't afford to hesitate now. Not when we're so close. The Black Star's course was locked in. Whatever was waiting for them out there, whatever it was that had been waiting for this moment, was just beyond the next jump, and they were about to meet it head-on. The silence between them grew heavier, as if the very ship were holding its breath, ready to step into the dark unknown. Holt knew that when they arrived, everything would change. The countdown to contact had begun, and whatever happened next, there would be no turning back. Chapter 4: Into the Abyss. The Black Star sailed through the vast emptiness of space, each moment stretching longer as they approached the coordinates. The hum of the engines, once a familiar comfort, now felt like a constant reminder of the quiet inevitability that was drawing closer. Holt's fingers hovered over the console, his eyes flickering between the coordinates, the transmission data, and the ever-approaching void outside the ship's observation window. They were getting closer to something big, something unknown. The ship's sensors pulsed gently, picking up minute fluctuations in the surrounding space. But nothing. No cloaked ships. No signs of activity. Just the stillness of deep space. Yet that silence seemed to thrum with the unspoken tension, the waiting. The message they had received was still echoing in Holt's mind, repeating like an intrusive whisper. You will know soon enough. It haunted him, the simplicity of it, the way it seemed to strip them of any sense of control. They weren't just following the signal anymore. They were walking right into its grip, whether they liked it or not. Captain Drake stood by the main console, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the swirling data in front of him. His posture was the only thing about him that seemed unwavering. The man had nerves of steel, but even Holt could see that the tension was wearing on him, gnawing at the captain's calm exterior. How much further? Drake asked, his voice as even as it had been since this all started. 10 minutes, Holt replied, his gaze fixed on the display. We'll be within range of the signal's origin in a few moments. Nothing to indicate any change in trajectory. It's almost as if whatever's out there is just waiting for us to show up. Drake nodded, but Holt could see the unease in his eyes. There was no mistaking it. Drake was good at hiding fear, but he wasn't invincible. And the uncertainty of the situation was eating at him as much as it was at Holt. We should be prepared for anything, Drake said, his voice low. If we get close enough and the signal still doesn't change, we'll send a probe. We need to know what we're walking into. Holt nodded, the plan making sense, but something about the captain's words felt hollow. They had no idea what they were going to find, and sending a probe into the unknown felt like sending a lamb to the slaughter. Understood, Holt replied, already preparing to initiate the probe launch protocol. They had only a few short minutes before they arrived at the coordinates, but he knew there would be no turning back once they made their move. The Black Star slowed, coming to a steady stop within range of the signal's source. The dark expanse of space seemed even more oppressive now, the endless void pressing in on them from all sides. Holt's eyes darted to the sensors, watching for any signs of movement, any hint that something, or someone, was out there. The comms console flickered, the usual static subsiding as it locked onto the incoming transmission once more. The same message repeated again, still firm in its certainty. We've been waiting for you. It was like the voice knew exactly when they would arrive, as though it had been preparing for this moment, patiently counting down the seconds. Holt's skin prickled with unease. The signal itself felt almost too perfect, too orchestrated, as though whatever was out there had anticipated their every move. We're getting close, Drake said, his voice more strained now. Send out the probe. Get us a visual? Holt didn't hesitate. He quickly accessed the launch protocol and engaged the probe. Within seconds, a small, spherical device detached from the Black Star, gliding silently into the void. It was equipped with long-range sensors, capable of scanning everything from ships to the faintest fluctuations in space. They would know soon enough if there was anything to see out there. The probe sent its first readings almost immediately, but instead of the usual data on cosmic debris, star systems, or radiation fields, the sensors returned nothing. The readout was blank, save for one peculiar detail. The probes picked up nothing, Holt said, frowning. It's just static. Nothing. Drake's voice was sharp now, his calm facade cracking. What do you mean, nothing? It's as if the probe isn't even there, Holt said, furrowing his brow. It's not returning anything usable. No radiation, no mass readings, nothing. It's like it's being absorbed into something, or it's being blocked by something we can't detect. Drake moved quickly to the console, his eyes scanning the data. The eerie emptiness of the readings was unsettling, and Holt could see the captain's frustration growing. If there was nothing out there, why had the signal led them this far? Why had it been waiting for them? Suddenly, the console buzzed, interrupting their thoughts. A new transmission came through. This time, a distorted series of symbols, followed by another message. Prepare, the voice crackled. Prepare for what comes next. Before either of them could respond, the entire ship shook. The tremors were subtle at first, just a faint quiver underfoot, but then they intensified. The console flickered and beeped as systems struggled to maintain their integrity under the stress. Holt braced himself against the console, his heart pounding in his chest. What the hell was that? Holt exclaimed, staring at the shaking display. Drake gripped the edge of the console, his eyes wide with sudden understanding. It's not us. The black star isn't moving. Something else is. The lights dimmed, and the ship seemed to groan under some unseen weight. A low, almost imperceptible hum began to fill the command center, vibrating through the walls, the floor, even the air itself. The sound was alien, a frequency that Holt couldn't quite place, but it made his skin crawl. Then it happened. The ship's main viewport darkened, and for a moment, everything was pitch black. The stars outside disappeared, as if they had been blotted out by something enormous. Holt's breath caught in his throat, and he turned to Drake, who was already staring at the viewport in disbelief. Captain, Holt started, his voice barely a whisper. What is that? Outside the black star, something vast loomed in the darkness. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't a structure. It was a presence, a massive, incomprehensible shape, shrouded in the emptiness of space. A feeling, like the weight of an ancient intelligence, washed over them both. And then, with terrifying suddenness, a voice filled the command center again. You have arrived. Chapter 5, The Reckoning. The voice reverberated through the command center, its tone cold and commanding, as though speaking from a place beyond space and time itself. Holt's heart raced, his pulse hammering in his ears as he stared at the darkened viewport. The presence outside, immense, incomprehensible, hung in space like an ancient shadow. It seemed to stretch beyond the limits of their perception, an entity larger than anything Holt had ever conceived. The lights flickered once more, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The hum from the ship's systems deepened, vibrating the very structure of the black star. Whatever was outside wasn't just observing them, it was affecting them, shifting the very fabric of reality around them. We have arrived, the voice repeated, its words echoing in Holt's chest. It wasn't speaking to them, it was speaking through them, and for a moment, Holt wondered if it could hear his every thought. The message was clear. They weren't in control anymore. Drake stood still, his face pale, as the enormity of the situation settled over him like a heavy fog. He wasn't a man given to panic, but Holt could see the cold sweat on his brow and the way his hands clenched into fists. The captain's usual composure was cracking, just as Holt's own was. What the hell is it? Holt finally managed, his voice hoarse. I don't know, Drake said, his voice barely audible over the growing hum. But it's not just waiting for us. It's been waiting for us. The ship shook again, more violently this time. The viewport darkened further, and the stars outside were swallowed by a swirling mass of shadow and light. It was like the black star had drifted into another dimension, one where the laws of space no longer applied. Holt gripped the console to steady himself, but he could feel his feet lifting off the ground, weightless in the face of something vast and unknowable. We need to get out of here, Holt said, his voice cracking with urgency. We can't stay in this, whatever this is. Captain, we But Drake was already at the helm, his fingers dancing across the console with a level of speed and precision that was almost unnatural. "I'm not running. Not yet." "What are you talking about?" Holt's breath caught in his throat. "We're not ready for this. We don't even know what we're dealing with." Drake didn't answer at first. His gaze was fixed on the viewport, his eyes tracking the darkness outside with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Then, with a sigh, he turned to Holt, his expression grim. "If we run now, it will follow us. This thing, whatever it is, it's waiting for us to make a move. If we leave, it will know. It will hunt us down, and we'll never be able to escape. Not unless we understand what it wants." Holt opened his mouth to argue, but something about Drake's tone stopped him. The captain was right. They couldn't run, not without knowing what they were facing. But the idea of staying, of confronting this thing, was nearly as terrifying as the unknown itself. A new transmission blinked onto the screen, overriding the other data. It was brief, just a few words, but the message was unmistakable. "We know you fear us." Holt's blood ran cold. This was not just a ship, not just a vessel or an entity. This was a presence, ancient and aware of their every move, every thought. The transmission wasn't a warning. It was a statement of power, a declaration that they were nothing more than pawns in a game that they couldn't begin to comprehend. "We can't fight this," Holt whispered, his voice barely audible. "We're not here to fight," Drake replied. His voice was steady, but his eyes were hard. "We're here to learn." Before Holt could protest further, the immense presence outside the Black Star seemed to surge, pulling at the very fabric of space around them. The hum grew louder, resonating deep in their bones, and the room seemed to bend, warping as though reality itself was being twisted. Then, a shape began to take form outside the viewport. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't even something that could be described in human terms. It was more like a distortion, a tear in the fabric of the universe itself. A massive, pulsing mass of swirling energy and light, with tendrils that reached out like the arms of a god, stretching across the void. Each movement was slow and deliberate, as if the entity were examining them, testing them. The transmission flickered back to life, but this time, the words that followed were not in any language they recognized. "You are the last." The words burned into Holt's mind, searing away any sense of reason or hope. The entity was speaking to them, acknowledging them. But why? The Black Star trembled again, and this time, the vibration was so intense that Holt could hear the ship's structure groaning under the pressure. The walls buckled slightly, and the air was thick with the smell of ozone. Something was happening. Something was being unleashed. Drake stood frozen, his gaze never leaving the massive shape outside. "It's waking up?" The next few seconds seemed to stretch into eternity. The air was thick with static, and the hum of the ship escalated to a deafening pitch. The viewport seemed to crackle with energy as the mass outside began to pulsate with greater intensity. There was a brilliant flash of light, a burst of pure energy that engulfed everything in its path. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the light faded, leaving the Black Star suspended in a vast emptiness. The presence was gone, leaving nothing but silence behind. Holt blinked, his head spinning. The ship was intact, barely. The systems were still functional, though flickering and unstable. He could feel the cold sweat on his forehead, the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. "We're alive," he whispered, not quite believing it. But Drake, though standing, looked as though he had seen something far worse than the terrifying force they had just encountered. He turned toward the console, his hands shaky, but his expression resolute. "We didn't escape," Drake said, his voice tinged with a bitter finality. "We were chosen, and now we have to live with what that means." Holt's eyes widened. The captain's words sank in, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. They had been chosen, but for what? As the Black Star drifted in the silence of space, Holt realized that they were no longer just explorers or survivors. They were part of something much larger, something ancient and unfathomable, and they had no idea what lay ahead. But one thing was certain, they were never truly alone out here. and they had just become a part of something beyond their understanding. The reckoning had begun. The end.